Hey, I'm ZSH Plays, and this is San Bernardino Zoo in 1965. This archive footage shows the bizarre habitat for polar bears which the zoo built in 1962. It has, for obvious reasons, been empty for many years, and today, we're going to transform it. In this episode, we're going to build that old polar bear pit and then transform it into a great habitat for something rather smaller. Let's go. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of lore there. I've been wanting to build something like this for absolutely ages. Now, San Bernardino Zoo may not be real, but the habitat we're building today is. It's taken from Stanley Park Zoo in Vancouver. It was actually built in 1962, and it actually held polar bears. The Stanley Park Zoo is closed now, and believe me, if you've seen the habitats they had there, you will not be surprised. They had several habitats just as crazy as this one. They all look like they were built by the Tekton group in 1930s. Had they had some kind of psychotic episode as they were designing it, they are not good at all, but there is just something about them that I really like. There were actually polar bears living in this habitat until 1997 when the last one died, and the zoo was then closed. Although if you're ever in Vancouver and you want to see this crazy habitat, it is still there now, just stood in the middle of a park outside Vancouver Aquarium, obviously empty. In terms of San Bernardino Zoo, I'm imagining that this was built back in the 60s for polar bears, and at some time around probably the beginning of the 1980s, when zoos started to get their act together in terms of animal welfare, it was decided that that needed to stop. The polar bears were moved out, and it's basically been sat there empty and unloved ever since. And when the zoo started developing the new Frozen North area, this habitat sat in the middle of where they wanted to build, so they needed to do something with it, and they decided, rather than destroying it, to save money like zoos always want to do, and reconfigure it to work for a smaller animal that would enjoy living here much more. Where did the polar bears go? Well, we'll find out in a couple of weeks' time. Let's talk about what we're doing in the build, because this really stretched my skills. So we've got this circular concrete pool here, which was all our poor polar bears had back in the 60s. And what I've done is put some glass barriers in so we can get some water into the pool, and then we'll drop these down so they're hidden by the concrete. Now, the way this habitat worked was that the polar bears were essentially marooned on an island of concrete with this pool in it and some crazy shapes going on around the side of it. And that was all set in the middle of a pit so that they basically couldn't get out, and then the guests would stand around walls at the edge of the pit and look at the polar bears. Now, this whole build is pretty much made up of circles and triangles, none of which are particularly easy to build in Planet Zoo. So we're going to be doing a lot of work with these little plaster blocks to create the shapes that we need, and we'll create one piece of shape. And then once we're happy with it, we can start copying that around to create the actual overall shape of the habitat. This is the first of those completed shapes, and what we're going to do is move this along around the edge of the pool and then rotate it so it follows the line of the pool, and we can start building up the rest of this concrete island that the polar bears lived on. Once we finish building the classic habitat and we start turning it into a modern habitat, one of the first things that we're going to do is enable our new animals to access the bottom of the pit, which will be filled with a nice substrate for them so they don't spend their whole lives walking around on concrete, which isn't great for animals' feet, and they can choose where to spend their time. That's the basics of the island done. It does have a certain beauty, but let's move on to the outer wall. The wall is made up of concrete blocks, one long one at the top and then smaller ones underneath. And I want you to be able to see the gaps between the blocks. So we've got this rectangular block at the top, and then we're going to take this square block underneath it and move this across here, and then we're going to copy it and make sure that there's a little gap between the two blocks so you can see where the joins are, like so. There we go. And then we'll get some more of these in underneath. We're building this above ground for obvious reasons, but most of it will be sunk into the ground when we're finished, when we dig the pit out, and it's all going to be covered in decals and things like that to make it look nice and old and like it's been here since the 1960s. I've got no idea how many plaster blocks it's going to take to finish this, but the answer is definitely a lot. So we're going to put another little row of them down here. This meets the ground, but we need one more below that so that when we sink it down, we've got a nice deep pit that would have been deep enough to keep polar bears in if they ever managed to get off the island. Then we're going to create a fence around the top to keep the guests safe. So we're going to use this little bit of aquatic fence here, get this onto the edge of this top block, and then we're going to take the, I think it's the European fence post, and connect that up to this aquatic fence post. So we get a simple metal design that matches the original. There we go, we'll put that one in there, and then we just need to recolor it so it matches the sort of unpainted look of the other one. Probably get very hot in Southern California, this, but I'm figuring metal was a common thing to use even in hotter places back in the 60s, so we'll keep that as it is. It looks pretty cool as well. Once this is all rotated around, I really like that. And there we go. That is the wall. We're going to drop this down to its correct height now with the help of our angry vendor there. So that is what it's going to look like from the path. And then we just need to raise some paths so that the guests are at the right height to look into it. So we'll raise the terrain here so that we can put paths on it, just get it level with the bottom of his shoes here. And then we can start raising this terrain all the way around the habitat so that we can get the paths in. And oh my god, this is one of the hardest paths I've ever had to put in. It might not look that complex, but getting this close enough to the edge of the habitat to look good whilst not creating terrain inside the habitat for when we're going to create the pit was an absolute nightmare. And if you find paths a nightmare, later on in this episode I'm going to be giving you some tips on how to best use them and the quickest ways to get them working. So with the paths in, we can dig out the pit. We use the terrain stamp tool for that and gradually reveal that island that we've already built. And once the terrain's all dug out, you got the basic idea of what the habitat is going to look like. Next up, we need to join the gaps between the paths and the habitat. We're going to use these concrete pieces here and just spin these around. These give us an almost seamless join between the path and the habitat. And now we're going to build the curved slope and the diving board. Yes, I said diving board. The polar bears had a diving board. So we're building a circle and then we're going to spin it on its side. And that is our curved ramp. So we'll bring this in here, and you can just see here for scale, this is who is going to be moving into our habitat at the end of the episode, the raccoons. I've wanted to get raccoons into the zoo since day one, hence why there used to be a big picture of raccoons on the outside of the zoo, but I've been waiting for the right place to put them. Hardly a massive animal for American zoos, what with them being considered a pest there, but they live all over the United States and beyond in temperate and colder forests, so I thought this would be a great little spot to put them, and they're small enough to give us an excuse to build this ludicrous polar bear habitat in the first place. The diving board is triangular. I'd love to build it out of plaster or concrete to match everything else, but we just don't have the shapes to make it work in the way that I need to, so we're going to use art shapes, just the standard triangular art shapes, and then we will copy them loads of times to make them three-dimensional. Then there's another little platform that the bears had access to, which again we'll build out of the little concrete blocks until we get the right shape. Looking good. Next up is a big pile of rocks next to the modernist pool. I assume the bears would have climbed on this or something. Maybe they jumped in from there when they didn't fancy using their crazy diving board. And then we'll put some steps in. These steps are going to lead back to the indoor quarters for the animals, and they're going to be rotated so they match up nicely with the circular piece of concrete that they're stood on, and then lead the animals back into the indoor quarters that we'll build in a second. The original habitat was slightly larger than this. There was a second, even smaller island that the polar bears had access to, but we are running pretty low on space in the frozen north, so we're not going to build the second, smaller part of this build. You can see the wall starting to carry off to the right there. That's where the second part of the habitat was. But bear in mind, they had, I believe, 4 polar bears in here. It might even have been 6, I can't remember, but an insane amount for a space this small. It's nowhere near big enough for one polar bear. But thankfully, those days are gone, and we're going to have something much more suitable in here by the end of the episode. The decision to combine modernist architecture with rustic stone walls like this was an interesting one on the part of the original designers, but we're going to copy it here. There are some nice colours in there. I do like the way it looks. There's a big chunky roof on top of the build, which contains loads of trees and plants. I couldn't see, no matter how many reference photos I looked at, if that was just on top of the building or if the ground actually sloped up at the back. And this essentially is what the habitat looked like in its heyday. Now it's time to start modernizing, but before we do that, it's time for Franchise Masters. There are a lot of paths in this zoo, and quite a few of you have asked me for some pathing tips and tricks, so that's what we're going to do. We all know that pathing is one of the most frustrating things in Planet Zoo, so let's try and ease that a bit. So for this example, what we're going to do is try and get some paths around this tree and this big rock here. We'll put a piece of path by this tree here, and the first tip is angle snap. If you hit the spacebar, you can turn angle snap on and off, and that means you can switch between very fine adjustments and nice geometric arrangements without having to go into any menus or move your mouse. You can also create perfect circles just by having angle snap turned on and making a right angle path like you see here. If you turn angle snap off, you can then adjust the size of the circle so that we can move our tree right into the middle of this circle here with a nice little bit of earth to plant it in. There we go. Now let's say we want a really big path around this rock here, so we'll take the size of the path up, but when we try and put it in, it's automatically joining onto the path that we've already got. The way to solve that is simply to hold down the control key. Doing that enables you to place the path wherever you want it, and if we do that little trick with the circle that we just did, we can get a really nice big path around that rock with no trouble. Now, let's say you want a path up in the air. How do we do that? If we hold down Control again, we can move the path around on the floor. And if we then hold down Shift at the same time, we can move the path up and down in the air. And when we get the right height that we want, we just let go of Shift, still keeping Control held down, and then we can place the path in the exact spot that we want. Just remember Control, Shift, and Spacebar, and soon you'll be making paths like this with ease. Well, as easy as it ever gets in Planet Zoo anyway. Let's get back to the build. The first thing we're going to do is start aging this habitat to make it look like it's been here since the 1960s, and we're mainly going to do that with decals. So we're going to be using some of the fairly major damage decals, and then loads and loads of the grunge and moss decals. I'm basing this on most of the reference photos I've seen of this habitat, which are of it now. It's quite a popular thing to take photos of in Vancouver, this crazy old polar bear habitat, empty and just sat on its own in the middle of a park. Must be a really bizarre thing to discover on your walk through the park if you're not expecting to see it there. So I've got loads of reference photos for what it looks like now, and we're going to try and get it really close to that without going too far into the realms of it looking like it's falling to pieces or anything, because obviously this is still very much an active habitat. And then once we've finished adding in all the moss and the cracks and the little discolorations in the concrete like we've got here, then we can start making it a suitable home for the raccoons. Most of the improvements that we make to this for the raccoons, I'm going to be using wood to differentiate it from the original habitat. We've got a little feeder for them here, and I'm actually going to use a little bit of metal and plastic just to make it sit in a bit better on that ramp there, and then the rest of it will predominantly be using wood. We're going to put some leaves in the pool just to add a little touch of realism. We'll have some floating on the water and then some sunk down to the bottom of the water. We've got a little ball for them to play with in there as well. And then we're going to start mulching up the roof so that we can get all the plants and trees up here. This is one of the most beautiful parts of the habitat, possibly the only beautiful part of the habitat, but the contrast between the vegetation up here in all different colours and then the stark concrete below makes for a really interesting visual. This was pretty much all temperate trees up in Vancouver, obviously a very different climate to Southern California, so I'm not sure how successfully you can grow some of these trees here. I'm sure the zoo's botanists will be able to find plants that do survive in Southern California that have similar shapes and colours, so that's absolutely fine. We'll get some bushes in as well, and then just start adding loads of different plants and stuff up here to really bring this to life. And once the garden's looking nice and full, we can move back to the habitat and start finishing that off. So what we're going to do is get loads of piles of rocks around the base of the central island. This is exactly what they have in Vancouver. So using these temple bricks again, love these temple bricks, rediscovered these last week and now I can't stop using them, but they are very, very close to what they actually had in Vancouver, so very pleased that I rediscovered them. And then we can set this habitat up so that the raccoons can get from the island down into the pit below, so they got way more room and lots of different things to interact with. I always think, especially with intelligent animals like raccoons, it's not so much how much space they have, although obviously there are requirements for that, but it's even more important that they have things to do and ways that they can display their natural behaviours. So with the choice of being down at the bottom on a natural substrate, fairly out of sight of the guests, little bits of vegetation to play with, and up on the concrete with all sorts of things to climb on and jump on, swim in the pool, the ramps, the diving board, etc., although I can't see them using that. I think this will make a really cute habitat for the raccoons, certainly better than for bears. Right, just one more thing to do, and then this habitat is complete, and that is a big sign. So we're going to use the raccoon sign, and as we do so often, use multiple copies of it to make it look three-dimensional, and then we're going to use a mixture of Leaf's Balboa font and Ricey's Balboa font to create a sign just to let people know what is in here and give it a much more modern looking facelift. And again, we will copy the letters behind each other and then make the ones at the back darker so we get a nice three-dimensional look on this as well. And there's a few more things that you'll see in the end cinematics, but that is the habitat done. Let's check it out. Meet the raccoons. I really like how this looks with the contrast between all those trees and the greenery and the orange and red behind, and then the stark white concrete, and then all the crazy stuff going on around it. It's never going to be a conventional habitat, but I think the raccoons are going to be really happy here. We've got one in the pool, and then we've got this melanistic raccoon, his name is Rocky, obviously, that I was very happy to find on the market. He's off to explore the lower level of the habitat, and I'm pretty happy with this. I think it's a really nice use for an old habitat in the zoo that was definitely past its best, and we finally got raccoons in the zoo. It's been a long time coming. As Rocky wanders off into the undergrowth, let's take a look at how the frozen north is getting along. Here's where we started today. And here's where we are now. You can just see it on the right hand side of the screen. The rectangle below it is where next week's inhabitant is going to go. Here's the Explorers Club monolith. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined over the past week, and everyone else of course. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next week for some more Planet Zoo. Bye.